I always thought betrayal would come with some dramatic flair, a slammed door, a screaming match, maybe even a broken plate. But mine arrived in silence, sealed inside a cream-colored envelope addressed to everyone but me. That was how I found out about Grandpa's while reading. A missed call from my cousin, then a group chat I was quietly removed from. I wasn't invited, not even by accident. At first, I tried to tell myself it was a mistake. Maybe someone had forgotten to include me. I scrolled through my phone, looking for an explanation, a stray text, anything. But nothing came. Days went by, and the silence got heavier, almost physical. It pressed against my chest every time I remembered Grandpa's voice, the way he used to pat my shoulder and call me his straight shooter. He was the only one in the family who seemed to really listen. The official reason for my exclusion arrived the night before the reading. My father called, his tone clipped and businesslike. He didn't even ask how I was. "Your presence isn't needed," he said flatly, as if I were some distant acquaintance. "You never showed much gratitude to your grandfather. It's time we stopped pretending otherwise." Gratitude. That word rang in my ears long after the call ended. Had I really been so ungrateful? Maybe I didn't laugh at every one of Grandpa's outdated jokes. Maybe I challenged the family narrative more than most. But I loved him. I just didn't always go along with the crowd. Maybe that was my real crime. I spent the night replaying old conversations, picking apart memories for clues of where I'd gone wrong. Was it that argument at last Thanksgiving? The time I skipped a family trip to focus on my finals? Every perceived slight was now a possible reason for being cast out. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. By morning, humiliation turned into something sharper, anger. What kind of family writes you out for not being a sycophant? If Grandpa had truly thought so little of me, I wanted to hear it with my own ears. If my relatives were twisting the story, I deserved to know. I thought about Grandpa's favorite phrase, the one he'd repeat whenever someone tried to push him around. "Don't let anyone else write your story for you." So, I made my decision. I got dressed, my hands shaking with nerves and adrenaline. My chest felt hollow but determined. I wouldn't be left out of this. Not because they said so. I would show up, uninvited, unwanted, and maybe unwelcome. But I'd be there to hear the truth. As I drove to the lawyer's office, my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Would they physically block me from entering? Would Grandpa's will confirm everything my father said? Or would I finally see, in plain daylight, what my family had always been hiding? By the time I parked outside the old brick building, my stomach was in knots. But the die was cast. Whatever happened next, I'd face it head on. The air inside the lawyer's office was colder than I expected. Not physically, I mean that kind of chill that comes from being stared at like a trespasser. My family sat in stiff, silent clusters along the wall, eyes flicking up as the door clicked behind me. I saw my father first, rigid in his dark suit, lips already pressed thin as he registered my arrival. My aunt whispered something sharp to my uncle, who shot me a glare so poisonous I half expected the plants in the corner to wilt. Nobody said hello. My cousin, who used to sneak me extra dessert at family dinners, looked away, embarrassed or afraid to be seen even glancing at me. I felt exposed, as if the label "Ungrateful" had been stamped in bold on my forehead. The lawyer, Mr. Halloran, glanced up from his papers and offered a neutral nod. For a split second, I saw something flicker across his face. Sympathy? Or just surprise that I'd had the nerve to come at all? I tried to find a seat, but every empty chair seemed to close up the second I approached. Finally, I perched at the end of the table, as far from my father as possible. I could feel every eye on me, measuring my worth, my right to be there. My father cleared his throat, and the entire room went still. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, but there was no warmth in it, only authority and contempt. "This is a private matter. We already divided everything. You weren't invited for a reason." He emphasized divided, as if the case was closed, as if my presence now was just an inconvenience, a disruption to their carefully choreographed plan. My hands shook, but I kept them out of sight, refusing to give him the satisfaction. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. For a second, I considered standing up and walking out, saving myself the humiliation. But then I remembered all those nights Grandpa sat with me in the garden, listening to my frustrations about this very family. I owed it to both of us to stay. So, I said nothing. Not a word. Just met my father's eyes and held his gaze. His confidence wavered for a split second, just long enough for me to see that, underneath his mask, he wasn't as certain as he pretended. The rest of the family shifted uncomfortably. The tension in the room built, thickening like fog. Mr. Halloran began shuffling the paperwork, clearing his throat. The The silence stretched until the only sound was the dull tick of the clock on the wall. Everyone seemed impatient for me to leave, for things to return to the way they'd planned. But I was done playing by their rules. As the lawyer prepared to begin, I felt a surge of defiance. Let them glare. Let them talk. I was here for Grandpa, and whatever he wanted to say from beyond the grave, I'd hear it, no matter how much my family wished I wouldn't, Mr. Halloran's voice cut through the tension, calm and practiced. Now that everyone is here, he began, shooting a pointed glance in my direction, I'll proceed with the reading of your grandfather's will. I could almost hear my father grinding his teeth. My aunt huffed and crossed her arms, but no one protested, at least not yet. I stared down at the polished mahogany table, the grains swirling in hypnotic patterns, willing myself to stay calm. If they were right, if everything had been divided without me, I'd walk away. But if not, well, I was prepared to finally see the truth in the open. Mr. Halloran opened a thick envelope and pulled out several sheets of paper. He cleared his throat again, as if bracing himself for impact. Before we begin, I want to clarify something. His tone shifted. I was told by several parties that the estate had already been divided amongst those present, and that there was no need for this meeting. That's not correct. Murmurs broke out immediately. My uncle leaned forward. What's that supposed to mean? We already. The lawyer held up a hand. I have a legal obligation to honor your grandfather's wishes, exactly as specified in this document. My father bristled. Just read it, he snapped. Let's get this over with. Mr. Halloran nodded and began. I, Walter J. Morgan, being of sound mind, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. He continued, reading the usual formalities, but every line only wounded the family tighter. When he reached the section about beneficiaries, he paused. For the first time, I saw him look directly at me, a strange intensity in his eyes. And so, to my beloved grandchild, he read my full name, and my heart hammered in my chest. I leave the entirety of my estate, assets, and property, without restriction or encumbrance. The words hit the table like a thunderclap. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My aunt's face blanched. My uncle's mouth dropped open. My cousin blinked rapidly, like she was about to faint. My father's voice broke the silence, cold and brittle. There must be some mistake. Where are the other names? The house, the accounts. Surely you mean divided? Mr. Halloran shook his head. No mistake. The will is clear. Everything passes to. He glanced at me again. The person you called ungrateful. It felt surreal, almost out of body. I was too stunned to speak. I kept waiting for someone to laugh, to say it was a cruel joke. But nobody did. My father lurched forward, snatching for the will. Let me see that. This is absurd. Mr. Halloran stood his ground, holding the documents firmly. Mr. Morgan, I can assure you this is a legally binding document. Your father made his wishes unmistakable. A tidal wave of shock rolled around the room. I sat frozen, emotions battling inside me. Disbelief, vindication, even a hint of fear. I met my father's eyes, and for the first time in my life, saw something close to uncertainty there. All I could do was sit quietly, absorbing the impossible. Grandpa hadn't forgotten me. He'd done the opposite. The moment the truth settled over the room, the atmosphere cracked like thin ice breaking beneath heavy feet. My father's face contorted. His usual composure shattered into anger and disbelief. This can't be, he spat, voice rising so sharply that the lawyer shushed him with a raised hand. No one's disputing the validity of the will, Mr. Halloran said firmly. Your grandfather made his intentions clear. I am simply here to deliver them. But the family wasn't ready to accept it. Voices erupted, sharp and bitter. My uncle snarled about fairness, calling it a manipulative power play. My aunt whispered venomous accusations about how the boy never cared. Even my cousins muttered in disbelief, some openly questioning Grandpa's mental state in his final days. The room descended into chaos, every accusation thrown like a weapon. I sat still, the storm raging around me, feeling like a fragile island in a sea of contempt. It was surreal hearing the very people who had excluded me call the decision unfair, as if the estate belonged to them by right, not to the person Grandpa chose. My father lunged toward the lawyer, demanding a copy of the will, his voice shaking with rage. I want a second opinion. This is a mistake. Mr. Halloran remained calm, folding the will neatly and sliding a copy across the table. You're entitled to consult your own counsel, of course. But until then, this document stands as your grandfather's final legal statement. A tense silence fell as my father scanned the pages. His eyes flicked to mine, burning with disbelief and fury. Then, something unexpected happened. He looked away. I realized then the real reason for my exclusion. The family had known this would happen. They'd labeled me ungrateful to justify shutting me out, expecting that if I stayed away, the will might be quietly ignored or challenged without me. Grandpa had outsmarted them all. The weight of that realization hit me hard. It wasn't just about money or property, it was about respect and integrity. Grandpa had recognized in me something worth preserving, even when my own family couldn't see it. I didn't gloat. I didn't relish their defeat. Instead, I kept my head high, feeling a quiet strength settle in my bones. The battle wasn't over, but I was no longer the outsider. I was the rightful heir. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of peace. The lawyer's voice softened as he pulled out another envelope, this one sealed with a faded wax stamp. Before we conclude, your grandfather left a personal letter to the beneficiary. His eyes met mine once more, as if urging me to brace myself. I unfolded the worn paper, hands trembling slightly. The handwriting was unmistakable, Grandpa's looping script, careful and deliberate. My dear grandchild, it began. If you are reading this, it means I have passed, and the time has come for you to understand why I made the decisions I did. I've watched this family for many years, and I saw what you saw, the greed, the petty squabbles, the endless grasping for what's not earned. He went on to describe how, despite my distance and their judgments, he had always admired my independence, how I stood firm in my principles even when it cost me dearly. You were labeled ungrateful, yes, he wrote, but I know your heart. You never sought my wealth or favors. You sought honesty and respect, something too few in this family understand. His words cut through years of pain and rejection, healing wounds I hadn't realized were still open. Grandpa's letter was not just an explanation but a challenge to honor the integrity he saw in me, to rise above bitterness and carry forward his legacy of quiet strength. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter carefully. I felt a swell of emotion, not just pride, but a profound connection to the man who had quietly defied the family's expectations, just as I had. I looked up at the faces around me. The room felt different now. The anger hadn't disappeared, but the weight of Grandpa's message hung in the air, undeniable and sincere. I promised myself, silently, to live up to those words, not for revenge, not to prove them wrong, but because that was what Grandpa believed I was capable of. That night, as I left the office, the letter tucked safely in my bag, I finally understood. This inheritance wasn't just money or property. It was a legacy of integrity entrusted to me to protect and carry forward. And I would I in the days following the will reading. The atmosphere around me shifted from icy to downright hostile. The family, blindsided and bitter, began their campaign to dismantle what Grandpa had built in my name. Text messages turned into phone calls, polite requests warped into desperate pleas and veiled threats. My siblings, those who had never spoken much before, suddenly emerged with wild ideas and plans. Think about the family legacy, they'd say, as if their entitlement made sense. We can work something out. You don't have to do this alone. Uncles and cousins showed up unannounced, each carrying a story of hardship or need, as if that entitled them to a piece of what was now mine. The guilt trips were relentless, aimed at chipping away at my resolve. At times, I found myself drowning in their expectations and accusations. They painted me as cold and selfish, refusing to share what was supposedly family property. But every call, every visit, tested something deeper in me. Grandpa's words echoed in my mind. Stand firm in your integrity. I realized this inheritance was a test, not just of money, but of character. How I handled this storm would define not only how I honored him, but who I was. The pressure was immense. Friends asked if I felt guilty, if I planned to compromise for the sake of peace. I was torn, lonely in this battle against a family that once meant everything to me. But the pain of exclusion had forged something stronger, something I hadn't expected. I chose to stand my ground. No bargains. No yielding. I would protect Grandpa's wishes, even if it meant being branded the villain. Because in the end, integrity was the only inheritance worth keeping. Weeks later, the dust had settled. I stood on the porch of Grandpa's old house, sunlight casting warm patterns through the trees. The estate was mine now, the full weight of responsibility and legacy resting on my shoulders. The rumors still drifted through the town like restless ghosts, whispers of unfairness, bitterness, and what-ifs. but I let them pass, untouchable. The property needed work, sure, but I saw beyond the cracked windows and creaking floors. I saw memories, Grandpa's laugh echoing in the halls, the garden where he taught me patience and resilience. Restoring this place was more than upkeep. It was honoring his spirit. My family's resentment simmered beneath the surface. Invitations stopped coming, phone calls dried up. At times, I mourned what we'd lost, the connection, the shared history, but I refused to let their bitterness define me. Instead, I focused on the promise I made to Grandpa, to carry forward not just his wealth, but his values. I started small, volunteering at the local community center, supporting causes he cared about. I was building a legacy not of money, but of meaning. Sometimes, late at night, I still wrestle with the wounds left by exclusion, the sting of being called ungrateful by those I once trusted. But in those moments, I remind myself who I am, the grandchild Grandpa believed in, chosen for my integrity, not for playing along. This inheritance is mine, not just because of a will, but because I earned it through strength, dignity, and unwavering loyalty to what's right. And that's a legacy no one can take away.